I still remember the day Lucas invited me to his house. Looking back now, it seems almost trivial, an ordinary invitation, but in that moment, it felt like the start of something that would quietly shift everything. I, Ethan, had always considered Lucas more than just a friend. We shared jokes, long nights of conversation, and the kind of trust that only develops over years. Yet, there was a subtle undercurrent in our friendship, something unspoken that neither of us fully acknowledged. That evening, it came closer to the surface than ever before. Lucas and I had met in college, both of us drawn to each other by a shared love for late-night movies and an absurd sense of humor. Over the years, our lives intertwined in ways that made separating the two of us almost impossible. He knew my fears, my regrets, and even my quiet hopes for the future. I knew the same about him. It was a friendship that had always been a safe space, a place where vulnerability didn't feel dangerous. And yet, there was a tension between us, subtle enough to dismiss as familiarity, but persistent enough that it made my chest tighten whenever we lingered too long on personal stories. When Lucas called me that afternoon, his voice carried the same easy charm I had grown accustomed to over the years. "Hey, Ethan. I know it's short notice, but my mom is hosting a small dinner at our place tonight. You should come, it wouldn't be the same without you." His tone was casual, but I could hear something beneath it, a quiet hope, a desire to share space with me. I hesitated only briefly. My rational mind reminded me that Daniel, his partner, would be away on a work trip. But curiosity, and perhaps an unacknowledged longing, won over. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'll be there." Arriving at Lucas's house was like stepping into a world that was both familiar and unexpectedly intimate. His mother, Mrs. Harper, greeted me warmly, her kindness immediately dissolving the slight tension I had carried from the drive. The house smelled faintly of lavender and fresh bread, a comforting combination that made the evening feel welcoming. Daniel's absence was mentioned lightly, as if it were expected, and Lucas busied himself in ways that made the home feel alive without any sense of urgency. I found myself relaxing, allowing the comfort of routine and familiarity to settle over me. The evening progressed with gentle laughter and light conversation, mostly surrounding mundane topics, work, hobbies, old college stories. Yet, there was an undercurrent, subtle but unmistakable. When Lucas spoke, there was a softness in his tone when he looked at me, a pause that lingered longer than necessary before shifting the topic. I caught myself noticing it, a part of me wondering if I was imagining something that perhaps didn't exist. But the feeling persisted, quietly unsettling and yet strangely magnetic. As the night grew quieter and Mrs. Harper retreated to her own room, Lucas and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The house felt different in this moment, intimate in ways that were impossible to ignore. We sank into the familiar rhythm of conversation, talking about everything and nothing, memories and minor regrets. The comfort of our shared history made the conversation flow effortlessly, but beneath it, I sensed a tension neither of us acknowledged. It was as though the walls themselves leaned closer, listening, urging us to confront the subtle emotions we had always avoided. I remember sitting there, feeling a mix of anticipation and unease. Something had shifted, though I couldn't yet name it. The ordinary visit, the casual invitation, had opened a door to emotions I had long kept buried. And even though nothing overt had happened, I felt it, the quiet pull of something unspoken, a line we were about to cross, though neither of us knew exactly how. In that stillness, I realized that the night had already begun to change everything, even if I couldn't yet understand the depth of it, and as Lucas handed me a cup of tea, smiling in a way that carried both warmth and something more, I felt a shiver of recognition. This was no longer just a friendly visit. Something unspoken had begun, something that would quietly unravel the careful boundaries we had always maintained. And in that moment, I understood, by the end of this night, nothing would be the same again. Daniel's visit was supposed to be brief. That was what Ryan had said, what I had repeated to myself the next morning as I hurried through classes, trying to shake the memory of the night before. Yet by evening, Daniel was still there, seated at the edge of the hostel common area with a paper cup of coffee, as if he had quietly settled into the rhythm of the place. Ryan treated it like a gift. He joked more than usual, proud to show off his father, eager for his approval. I stayed close but quiet, observing Daniel from a distance, telling myself that whatever I had felt was nothing more than curiosity. Still, each time his eyes found mine across the room, my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. Over the next 2 days, moments repeated themselves. Not dramatically, not intentionally. A shared elevator ride. A brief conversation while Ryan stepped away to answer a call. Ordinary gaps in time that filled themselves with something unspoken. Daniel never crossed a line, never lowered his voice or leaned too close. That restraint made everything heavier. One afternoon, Ryan left to meet friends off campus, leaving Daniel and me in the hostel room again. The door clicked shut, and I felt the same awareness return, sharper this time because I recognized it. "You don't have to stay," I said, more out of nervousness than politeness. Daniel smiled faintly. "I don't mind the quiet." He sat, and I remained standing, unsure where to place myself. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. Daniel asked about my family, my plans after graduation. His questions weren't probing, just patient. When I admitted I wasn't sure who I wanted to become, he didn't laugh or correct me. "Uncertainty isn't weakness," he said. "It usually means you're paying attention." Something shifted then. I realized I wanted him to keep talking, not because of what he said, but because of how he listened. I found myself sharing more than I meant to, my fear of disappointing people, my confusion about closeness, the loneliness that followed me even in crowded rooms. Daniel responded carefully, choosing his words as if they mattered. He spoke about his marriage without bitterness, describing distance rather than failure. Long silences at home. Conversations that stayed polite instead of honest. He didn't ask for sympathy, yet I felt it rise in me anyway. At some point, I noticed how natural it felt to sit across from him, how easily the hours passed. That realization startled me. I stood abruptly, pretending to organize my desk, needing space from my own thoughts. "This is wrong," I told myself. Not because anything had happened, but because something was happening inside me. That night, sleep refused to come. Ryan snored softly from the other bed, unaware of the quiet storm building beside him. I replayed Daniel's voice, the calm weight of his attention. Guilt pressed against my ribs, sharp and insistent. He was my friend's father. He was married. I reminded myself of these facts until they blurred into repetition. The next evening, it happened again. Ryan left early, distracted and careless, promising to return later. Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the campus lights. "I should head back to my hotel," he said, though he didn't move. I nodded, waiting. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The room felt smaller than it had any right to be. Daniel turned toward me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as if he might say something important, something irreversible. Instead, he exhaled slowly and stepped back. "This isn't appropriate," he said quietly, not accusing, not apologizing. Just stating a boundary he had clearly been fighting. The words landed harder than I expected. Relief and disappointment tangled together inside me, leaving me unsure which one hurt more. Daniel picked up his jacket, his movements deliberate, controlled. "I respect you," he added. "That matters." He left without waiting for a response. The door closed, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation we'd shared. I sat on my bed, staring at the empty space he'd occupied, my thoughts racing. Nothing had happened. Yet everything felt altered. I understood then that infidelity didn't always announce itself through action. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, through attention, through restraint, through what almost happened. As I lay back and closed my eyes, one truth settled in with unsettling clarity: the line hadn't been crossed, but it had been seen, and once you recognize a line, pretending it doesn't exist becomes impossible. The morning Daniel left arrived without ceremony. No announcements, no lingering goodbyes. I woke to the sound of Ryan moving around the room, humming to himself as he packed a small bag for his father. The normality of it all felt almost cruel. I stayed quiet, watching from my bed, measuring my words before they ever reached my mouth. Daniel appeared in the doorway moments later, freshly dressed, composed as always. If the night before had unsettled him, he gave no sign of it now. His calm was complete, practiced, and I wondered how long he had learned to wear it. "Morning, Ethan," he said, his tone polite, neutral. That I returned the greeting, forcing my voice to match his. For a brief second, our eyes met, and something unspoken passed between us, acknowledgement without invitation, memory without desire. Then Ryan stepped between us, breaking the moment without knowing it had existed. The walk to the hostel entrance was short. Ryan talked the entire way, filling the air with plans and jokes, unaware of the careful distance Daniel kept from me. When they stopped near the gate, Daniel shook my hand again. It was as brief as before, yet it carried finality. "Take care of yourself," he said. The words sounded ordinary, but I felt their weight. Daniel turned away, and just like that, he was gone. No last look. No hesitation. The restraint he had chosen felt deliberate, almost protective. Ryan didn't notice the silence that followed. He returned to his routines, to classes and laughter, to a world unchanged. I followed along, smiling when expected, answering when spoken to. Inside, something had shifted its position, settling deeper where it could no longer be ignored. Days passed. Then weeks. Daniel didn't call, didn't send messages through Ryan. His absence became its own presence. I caught myself listening for footsteps that would never return, replaying conversations that had ended exactly where they needed to. At night, I thought about boundaries. About how close someone could come without ever crossing them. Daniel had seen the edge and stepped back. I wasn't sure I could have done the same. That realization unsettled me more than temptation ever had. That I began to understand that what had formed between us was not desire alone, but recognition. He had seen me clearly at a moment when I felt invisible. I had seen his quiet dissatisfaction, his restraint shaped by responsibility. We had met in the space between longing and loyalty, and neither of us had known what to do with it. One evening, as Ryan talked excitedly about visiting home soon, he mentioned his parents. His words were affectionate, careless. I listened without interruption, guilt tightening briefly in my chest before easing into something calmer. I hadn't betrayed him through action, but I had learned something uncomfortable about myself. Infidelity, I realized, was not always a betrayal of others first. Sometimes it was a betrayal of the version of yourself you believed you were. Daniel had chosen distance. In doing so, he had given me something unexpected: clarity. I saw how easily attention could become attachment, how quickly loneliness could disguise itself as connection. I saw how restraint, though painful, could be an act of respect rather than denial. The memory of that silent hostel room stayed with me, not as regret, but as a lesson. It taught me that some moments demand nothing more than awareness. That not every feeling needs to be acted upon to leave its mark. On the surface, life returned to normal. Classes continued. Friendships remained intact. Ryan trusted me completely, and I learned to live with that trust without flinching. Yet beneath it all, I carried a quiet understanding that shaped how I approached closeness afterward. Years later, I can still picture that room, the dim light, the pauses between words, the choice that was made without being spoken. Nothing happened that night, and yet everything changed, because from that moment on, I understood the power of restraint, the cost of attention, and the truth that some lines are most dangerous not when they are crossed, but when they are almost crossed and you finally see yourself standing there. Time has a way of softening sharp edges without erasing them. By mid-semester, the campus had moved on. New gossip replaced old whispers, and the football season swallowed attention the way it always did. From the outside, Lucas Carter looked unchanged, still the captain, still admired. But distance teaches you to see differently. From afar, I noticed how often he stood alone now, how his laughter seemed measured instead of effortless. That we hadn't spoken since that afternoon by the academic building. The silence between us wasn't hostile, it was deliberate. I understood now that some connections end not because they explode, but because continuing them would cause further harm. Letting go was the only honest choice left. Emily's name surfaced occasionally in conversations I overheard. People speculated, filling gaps with imagination. No one knew the truth, and I didn't correct them. This wasn't my story to claim publicly. Accountability doesn't require an audience that I focused inward instead. I questioned why being needed had felt so validating, why I had mistaken emotional closeness for permission. I wasn't proud of my role, but I refused to bury it under excuses. Growth, I learned, comes from naming your mistakes without turning them into an identity point. One evening, weeks later, I ran into Lucas outside the library. It was unplanned, unavoidable. He stopped first, uncertainty flickering across his face. For a moment, I considered pretending I hadn't seen him. But avoidance had already taught me its limits. Ethan, he said. Lucas. The exchange was simple, restrained. Yet beneath it lay everything we weren't saying. He looked healthier, steadier. Not happier, just more grounded. I wanted to thank you, Lucas said after a pause. For what? I asked. For walking away, he replied. I didn't understand it then. I do now. The honesty surprised me, but it didn't reopen old wounds. If anything, it confirmed they were healing. It was the right thing, I said. Even if it didn't feel like it at the time. Lucas nodded. Emily and I, we're not together anymore. That decision had nothing to do with you in the end. It had to do with me finally admitting what I wasn't ready to face. I absorbed that quietly. Relief and sadness coexisted without conflict. His clarity didn't absolve the past, but it reframed it. I hadn't ruined something whole, I had exposed something already fractured. I hope you're figuring things out, I said. So do I, Lucas replied with a faint smile. For the first time, that feels honest. We parted without promises, without nostalgia. Some stories don't need revisiting to be meaningful. They need understanding. As I walked away, I realized something else had shifted. I no longer defined myself by being someone's secret. I didn't crave validation from being chosen quietly. I wanted openness, even if it took longer to find. Infidelity had taught me that love built in shadows eventually collapses under its own weight. That emotional shortcuts lead to long regrets. And that integrity often asks for sacrifices that feel unfair in the moment but make sense in hindsight. I don't know where Lucas's journey will lead him. I only know where mine is going now. Toward honesty. Toward connections that don't require hiding. Toward a version of myself that doesn't confuse empathy with obligation. Some nights, I still think about that first invitation, the dorm room, the trophies, the silence thick with possibility. It would be easy to romanticize it, to imagine an alternate ending where desire won and consequences didn't exist, but that story wouldn't be true. The truth is quieter, heavier, and more valuable. It's the understanding that not every intense connection is meant to be pursued, and not every feeling deserves action. Sometimes, the most meaningful choice is the one that leaves you alone, but intact, and if this story continues, as all lives do, it won't be built on secrecy. It will be built on lessons learned the hard way, and the hope that next time, I'll choose clarity before temptation has the chance to speak.